The first time I realized my wife no longer respected me, she laughed while another man touched her wrist. It happened at our 20th anniversary dinner, a restaurant beside the river, dim amber lights, soft piano music drifting through the room like smoke nobody noticed anymore. My youngest son, Daniel, had insisted we celebrate properly because Mom deserved something nice for once. For once. I remember that phrase more than the laughter. I had spent 31 years working double shifts at the freight company so my children could grow up in a better neighborhood than I did. 31 years waking before sunrise. 31 years fixing leaking sinks at midnight because we couldn't afford plumbers back then. 31 years pretending exhaustion was normal. And somehow, by the end of it, I had become the man standing quietly at the edge of his own life while everyone else explained who deserved what. My wife, Eleanor, sat across from me wearing the dark green dress I bought her 10 Christmases earlier. She still looked beautiful in the kind of way that made strangers straighten their posture when she walked past them. Age had sharpened her elegance instead of softening it. Mine had only settled into my bones. Our oldest daughter kept checking her phone during dinner. Daniel spent most of the evening talking about investment opportunities I barely understood. My other son, Michael, arrived 40 minutes late without apologizing. Only Richard arrived on time. Richard Hale, my best friend for 26 years. The kind of friend who helped carry your father's coffin without being asked. The kind who showed up after surgeries with groceries and quiet conversation. The kind who knew where the spare house key was hidden because life had once felt safer with people like that around. He hugged Eleanor first. That should not have mattered, but it did. His hand lingered against her wrist as she laughed at something he whispered. A private laugh. Small. Intimate. Familiar in a way married people usually recognize before they can explain it. Then she looked at me, not guilty, not nervous, just irritated, as if she had caught me noticing something inconvenient. People think betrayal arrives like broken glass. It doesn't. Real betrayal arrives quietly. It sits down at your dinner table smiling politely while your children pour it wine. The rest of the evening unfolded like theater, performed for someone already leaving the audience. Richard told stories that made everyone laugh. Eleanor corrected me twice when I misremembered dates from old vacations. Daniel joked that I was becoming senile because I forgot the name of one of his clients. Nobody noticed I stopped eating halfway through dinner. Or maybe they noticed and didn't care. That possibility ages a man faster than hard labor ever could. On the drive home, rain crawled slowly across the windshield while Eleanor stared out the passenger window. "You embarrassed me tonight," she said finally. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "How?" "You looked miserable the entire dinner." "I was tired." "You're always tired." There are sentences that sound harmless until you realize they've replaced compassion entirely. You're always tired. Not, you work too hard. Not, are you all right? Just quiet resentment toward the visible evidence of sacrifice. I watched the blurred road lights slide across the wet pavement. "You and Richard seem close lately." The words came out calm. Too calm. She turned toward me slowly. "He listens to me." That was all she said. But I understood. A marriage rarely dies when love disappears. It dies when dignity does. After that night, I began noticing things I should have noticed earlier. Richard calling the house when he knew I was working late. Eleanor smiling at messages she angled away from me. The sudden criticism of my clothes, my posture, my breathing, the way I chewed food, the way I sat in my own recliner after work. When people emotionally replace you, they first begin editing you into someone unbearable. It helps them justify what comes next. 3 months later, Daniel asked if I could help cover part of the down payment on his new house. Again. He stood in the kitchen, pretending embarrassment, while Eleanor defended him before I even answered. He's trying to build something for his family. I looked at my son. 32 years old. Designer watch. Luxury SUV parked outside. Still asking me for money. How much? 40,000? The number hung in the kitchen beside the ticking wall clock. I actually laughed a little. Not because it was funny, because exhaustion sometimes sounds like laughter. I don't have that kind of cash available. Eleanor folded her arms immediately. You have retirement savings. That's retirement. You act like we're strangers asking. There it was again. That word, we. Not your son, not Daniel, a united front. I realized then that I had slowly become the outsider inside my own home. Families do not collapse all at once. They erode gradually. Respect disappears first, gratitude second. Then eventually your humanity itself becomes negotiable. Daniel left angry. Eleanor spent the rest of the evening slamming cabinet doors hard enough to shake the dishes. Around midnight, I walked downstairs for water and noticed light beneath the den door. Richard's voice drifted softly through the crack. I froze. Eleanor laughed quietly. Not the polite laugh she used with neighbors. Not the careful laugh she used with our children. This one was softer, younger somehow, intimate. I stood in the dark hallway holding an empty glass while my wife whispered to another man inside my house after midnight. Then I heard it. Her voice, low and exhausted. I can't do this with him anymore. Silence answered first. Then Richard. You won't have to forever. My hand tightened around the glass so hard I thought it might break. But I didn't move. That's the strange thing about long marriages. Even betrayal arrives tangled with routine. Part of me still worried about making noise on the staircase. I should have opened the door, should have confronted them, should have demanded honesty. But age teaches you something painful about human nature. When people think you are weak, they reveal themselves more completely. So I stayed still and listened. Eleanor sighed. He notices things more lately. Richard chuckled softly. He notices after 20 years? 20 years. My chest went cold. Not anger. Not yet. Something worse. The realization that your life may have been rewritten long before you noticed missing pages. Then Eleanor said the sentence that changed everything. He still thinks you're his best friend. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, older, like the walls themselves had heard too much already. I stared at the family photograph sitting beside the staircase. Me smiling beside Eleanor at a beach 24 years ago. Daniel on my shoulders. Michael holding my hand. Our daughter Claire leaning against Eleanor's side. An entire life frozen inside a frame. And downstairs, beneath that photograph, my wife and my best friend discussed me like an obstacle that had not moved out of the way yet. I went back upstairs quietly, sat alone on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 31 years of marriage, I took off my wedding ring willingly. Not dramatically, not angrily. I simply placed it on the nightstand beside my old wristwatch and stared at both objects until dawn touched the curtains. Some people confuse unconditional love with permanent access. That night, for the first time, I began wondering what would happen if I quietly removed mine. And downstairs, hidden beneath years of polite smiles and family dinners, the truth was still getting worse. I did not sleep that night. The bedroom felt unfamiliar after Eleanor finally came upstairs. She moved carefully, assuming I was asleep. I kept my breathing steady while she changed clothes in the dark. The mattress shifted as she lay beside me. 31 years of marriage teaches you the geography of another person's habits. I knew when she was angry by how sharply she pulled the blanket. I knew when she was anxious by the rhythm of her breathing. And that night, she sounded relieved. That disturbed me more than anything I had overheard. Morning arrived gray and wet. Rain pressed softly against the kitchen windows while the coffee brewed. I was already dressed when Eleanor came downstairs. She looked surprised. "You're up early." "I have paperwork." She opened the refrigerator. No apology, no awkwardness, just the smooth confidence of someone certain the ground beneath her feet would never move. I watched her from the kitchen table. The faded toolbox still sat near the back door where I had left it 2 weeks earlier after fixing the gutter. Paint worn off the handle, metal corners rounded by decades of use. Funny how objects age honestly. People rarely do. Eleanor poured coffee. "You left your ring upstairs." I looked toward the window. "I know." Silence settled between us. "You being dramatic now?" "No." She stirred sugar into her cup. "You know," she said, "most men our age actually try to hold on to their marriages." The sentence landed gently. That was her talent. Cruelty delivered politely. I studied her face. No fear, no guilt. Only irritation that I had altered the routine. The ticking wall clock sounded louder than usual. Then her phone vibrated. She glanced down, smiled, and turned the screen away. The same small movement I had started noticing months earlier. Perhaps years. Children rarely notice a father disappearing until the things he carried begin disappearing first. Wives sometimes work the same way. I finished my coffee without another word and left for work. The freight office sat near the industrial district where diesel hung permanently in the air. I had spent most of my life there. People assume loyalty belongs to families. Sometimes it belongs to workplaces instead. Machines break predictably. Schedules fail honestly. People usually offer less clarity. Around noon, I received a message from Michael. "Need help again. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen. Michael was 35 and perpetually surrounded by emergencies that somehow required my wallet. 3 failed businesses, 2 refinanced cars, endless explanations. He inherited Eleanor's charm and her talent for making dependence sound temporary. We met that evening at a diner near the highway. He looked exhausted, or rehearsed. With Michael, it was often difficult to tell. He slid into the booth and smiled. "Dad?" I nodded. He ordered before speaking about money. That told me enough. After coffee arrived, he sighed heavily. "Things are tight." "They usually are." He ignored that. "Laura lost hours at work. Mortgage is behind." "How far behind?" 3 months. I waited. He rubbed his forehead. "I need 15,000. Outside, rain streaked the windows. Inside, silverware clinked softly against plates. The ordinary sounds of people living lives untouched by this conversation. I folded my hands. "You still paying for the boat?" His expression hardened. "That's not fair." "You asked." "It's not about the boat."
It usually is. Michael leaned back. I knew you'd judge me. There it was. The familiar inversion.
Responsibility transformed into cruelty. Boundaries recast as betrayal. I had spent decades watching this pattern without naming it. People become remarkably creative when protecting access to someone else's sacrifices. You helped Daniel. I helped Daniel 12 years ago. You always keep score. I looked at him carefully. No, I said. I keep records. His jaw tightened. You know what Mom says about you? I felt something shift inside me. Not pain, recognition. What does she say? That you make people beg. The waitress refilled our cups. Neither of us spoke until she left. Then Michael said quietly, She says you like watching people depend on you. I looked down at the coffee. Funny. I had spent half my life feeling ashamed for not giving more. And now generosity itself had been rewritten into manipulation. I paid for lunch and stood. No loan this time. His chair scraped backward. You'd let your grandkids suffer? The accusation came quickly. Practiced. Children weaponized through guilt. I reached for my coat. I spent years making sure nobody suffered. You're unbelievable. No, I said softly. Just tired. His face flushed. You sound like a victim lately. I almost answered. Almost told him about the midnight conversation. About Richard. About Eleanor. Instead, I watched rain slide down the diner windows. Fatherhood changes strangely with age. When children are young, they believe you know everything. When they become adults, they often need to believe you understand nothing. It makes disappointment easier. That evening, I returned home later than usual. Richard's truck sat in the driveway. My hands remained steady on the steering wheel. Steady hands do not mean calm hearts. The house smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted chicken when I entered. Voices drifted from the dining room. Eleanor, Richard, Claire. My daughter looked genuinely happy to see me. She still hugged me with both arms. Sometimes small mercies keep a man alive longer than medicine. Dad, she smiled. Richard raised a glass. There he is. I removed my coat slowly. Nobody had invited me to dinner. That detail mattered. Eleanor moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. You're late. I wasn't aware of plans. Claire glanced between us. Oh, Mom said you knew. Of course she had. I sat anyway. The old wristwatch felt heavier against my skin. Dinner conversation moved around me instead of through me. Richard and Eleanor discussed a charity event. Claire mentioned school schedules for her children. Then Richard said something that stopped the room. Actually, he smiled, Eleanor and I have been talking about a little project. I looked up. Eleanor dabbed her mouth with a napkin. We haven't decided yet. What project? Claire asked. Richard leaned back comfortably. The lake property. My fork paused. Lake property. 20 acres outside town. My father's land. Inherited after his death. Still legally mine. I looked at Eleanor. She avoided my eyes. We thought maybe, Richard continued casually, it's time to develop it. Something cold moved through me. Not because of the suggestion, because of the pronoun. We. Not Eleanor and I, not family. Richard and Eleanor. Talking about my father's land. Making plans I had never heard. Claire frowned. I thought Grandpa wanted that land preserved. He's gone, Eleanor said. The sentence arrived too quickly, too cleanly. Richard nodded. Times change. I set my fork down. When did these conversations start? The room quieted. Eleanor looked annoyed again. Don't start. Start what? This attitude. Richard smiled carefully. We were only brainstorming. I studied him. 26 years of friendship sat across the table pretending comfort. Then I noticed something. A small silver keychain beside Eleanor's purse. I knew it immediately. Because I had given Richard that exact keychain 15 years earlier. Attached to it, a house key. Not his. Mine. And suddenly I realized something I had never authorized. Someone had copied a key to my home. The chicken cooled untouched on my plate while the clock ticked softly above us. And nobody at that table looked surprised. I kept staring at the keychain long after the conversation moved on. The silver edges were scratched near the ring where Richard used to spin it around his finger during long drives. I remembered buying it at a roadside gas station during a fishing trip 15 years earlier. Back then, it had felt like the kind of meaningless gift men exchange when friendship still feels permanent. Now it sat beside my wife's purse like evidence no one bothered hiding anymore. Claire kept talking about her youngest son's school recital, but her voice sounded distant to me. I looked at Eleanor. When did Richard get a key? The room quieted again. Not dramatically. Just enough. Eleanor reached for her wine glass. You're making something small into a problem. That wasn't my question. Richard leaned forward first. You were working long hours back then. Eleanor thought it was smart in case something happened around the house. Interesting, I said softly, because I don't remember being asked. His smile tightened slightly. Claire looked uncomfortable now. Dad, it's all right, I told her. But it wasn't. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The actual affair hurt less than the years of invisible permissions surrounding it. The copied key, the private plans, the shared jokes. The slow rewriting of boundaries while I was busy paying mortgages and repairing furnaces and making sure everyone else felt secure. People rarely destroy you openly. They simply start living as though your consent no longer matters. Dinner ended early after that. Claire hugged me goodbye in the hallway. You okay? I nodded automatically. Fathers learn to lie gently. It keeps children comfortable longer. After she left, Richard stayed another hour. I listened to their voices from upstairs while pretending to organize old paperwork in my study. The study had once been the quietest room in the house. Eleanor used to bring me coffee there when the children were young. Sometimes she sat on the floor beside my desk while I balanced bills late at night. Funny how memory becomes dangerous after betrayal. Every happy moment starts feeling counterfeit. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the front door close. Richard leaving. Or so I thought. A few minutes later, Eleanor came upstairs and stopped in the doorway of the study. You embarrassed everyone tonight. I continued sorting papers. I asked a question. You interrogated us. Us. Her expression hardened. You know what your problem is? I finally looked at her. No. You make people feel watched. The sentence almost made me smile. Watched. After 31 years of being ignored inside my own home, I wasn't aware observation was offensive. "You always do this," she folded her arms. "You sit there quietly judging everybody." Quietly. That word again. As though silence itself had become threatening now that I was no longer apologizing for it. "You're angry because people stopped revolving around you." I leaned back slowly in the chair. The old leather creaked beneath me. "When exactly did they revolve around me?" She opened her mouth, closed it, because deep down she knew the truth. I had never been the center of this family, only the foundation underneath it. And foundations are rarely loved until they crack. Eleanor sighed heavily. "You've changed lately." "No," I said. "I've noticed lately." That landed. I saw it in her eyes immediately. For the first time in months, maybe years, she looked uncertain. Only for a second. Then the irritation returned. "You're imagining problems because you're aging." There are insults that sound accidental when spoken calmly enough. Aging, forgetful, paranoid, fragile. The vocabulary families use when they need a man to distrust his own instincts. I looked down at the paperwork spread across the desk. Bank statements, insurance documents, property taxes, 3 decades of invisible maintenance holding everyone's lives together. "You know," I said quietly, "I used to think sacrifice created loyalty." She laughed softly. "Here we go." "But it doesn't. It creates expectation." She stared at me like I was speaking another language. Maybe I was. Pain changes dialects over time. Eleanor stepped closer. "You want honesty?" "Yes." "I've spent years feeling alone in this marriage." I nodded once. "Because I worked." "Because you disappeared emotionally." That sentence sat heavily between us. Because part of it was true. Long hours had hollowed me out over the years. Exhaustion had turned me quiet. I stopped taking vacations, stopped talking much at dinner, stopped noticing when Eleanor changed her hair. But there's a cruel thing people do with partial truths. They use them to excuse complete betrayals. I gave this family everything I had, and we appreciated it. No, they appreciated access to it. There's a difference. Eleanor looked toward the hallway before lowering her voice. "You think you were easy to love?" The question hit harder than shouting would have, because it sounded rehearsed, like something she had already discussed elsewhere, perhaps downstairs, perhaps with Richard. I suddenly realized how many conversations about me had probably happened without me. Private narratives, shared frustrations, little edits to my character repeated often enough to become accepted truth. That realization aged me more than the affair itself. She moved toward the door. "I'm tired of this victim act." Then she stopped and added quietly, "You're not the only person who sacrificed things." After she left, I sat alone in the study for nearly an hour. The rain had stopped outside. Water dripped rhythmically from the gutter near the kitchen window. I stared at the family photograph on the shelf beside the desk. 24 years old. The beach trip. Claire missing her front tooth. Daniel sunburned. Michael laughing at something outside the frame. Eleanor leaning against me before distance became her favorite form of punishment. I picked up the photograph carefully and noticed something strange. The frame had been moved recently. A faint square of dust marked where it normally rested. I frowned, then slowly opened the back panel.
Empty. I froze. There used to be documents hidden there. Not money, not secrets. Just emergency copies of old financial records and property paperwork my father taught me to keep hidden decades ago.
Gone. Every page. My chest tightened. I stood immediately and walked downstairs. The kitchen lights were off. Only the small lamp above the stove remained on, casting soft yellow shadows across the counters. Then I noticed it. One cabinet drawer slightly open. Inside, empty folders. The same folders I kept hidden behind old appliance manuals. Someone had searched my house carefully, not randomly, deliberately. I heard footsteps upstairs. Eleanor moving through the bedroom, calm, unhurried, as if nothing inside this house belonged exclusively to me anymore. And suddenly a memory surfaced. 3 weeks earlier, Richard standing near the study while I showered after work. "Still keeping all your important paperwork hidden around here like a paranoid old man?" he had joked. At the time, I laughed. Now my stomach felt cold. Because jokes are often rehearsals for truth. I closed the drawer slowly, then walked back upstairs carrying the empty folders in my hands. The bedroom door stood partially open. Eleanor sat at the vanity, brushing her hair. She looked at my reflection in the mirror. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then I placed the folders gently on the bed behind her. And for the first time in 31 years of marriage, I saw genuine fear enter her eyes. Eleanor did not turn around immediately. She kept brushing her hair slowly while watching me through the mirror. One stroke, then another. The silver-backed brush moved steadily through dark strands, touched lightly with gray near the temples. Controlled, measured. But her eyes had changed. Fear always enters quietly before people realize panic is justified. "What is this?" she asked finally. I looked at the empty folders resting on the bedspread. "That's what I'd like to know." She set the brush down carefully. "You're being ridiculous. Someone searched my study. You probably misplaced them." "No." The answer came too quickly for her comfort. I saw it in the tightening around her mouth. People who lie calmly often depend on others sounding uncertain. Confidence disrupts the performance. Eleanor stood and crossed her arms. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" I almost laughed. Not because anything was amusing, because accusation implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was disappearing now. I picked up one of the folders. "These were hidden. It's our house." "No," I said quietly. "It's my father's house." That landed harder than I expected. Her face shifted instantly. Not guilt, resentment. The kind that accumulates slowly over years inside people who believe sacrifice should eventually transfer ownership. Marriage changes language over time. Mine, yours, ours, and eventually, what's the difference anymore? Eleanor folded her arms tighter. "You really want to divide things now?" Things were divided long before tonight. Her jaw flexed. "You know what your problem is, Harold?" It had been months since she used my first name gently. Now it sounded clinical. "You keep acting like everyone's against you." I studied her quietly. There's a difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. The bedroom fell silent. Rainwater still dripped faintly outside. The old clock downstairs ticked through the walls. A house full of ordinary sounds surrounding an increasingly unfamiliar marriage. Then Eleanor said something that revealed more than she intended. "You've become obsessed ever since you started noticing Richard and me together." Started noticing, not imagining. Not misunderstanding, not overreacting, noticing. Tiny mistakes expose enormous truths. I walked to the nightstand where my wedding ring still rested beside the wristwatch. I heard you downstairs 3 nights ago. Her face emptied instantly. Not confusion, not denial. Calculation. That hurt most. People who still love you react emotionally first. People protecting themselves react strategically. Eleanor looked away toward the window. How much did you hear? Enough. The words stayed inside my chest without leaving my mouth. Instead, I asked, how long? Her shoulders stiffened. That's not a fair question. There it was. Not, nothing happened. Not, you're wrong. Only negotiation. I suddenly felt exhausted beyond anger. Like some invisible structure inside me had finally collapsed under years of weight. You know, I said softly, I used to think betrayal required cruelty. Eleanor stayed silent. But most betrayal is just convenience. She looked back at me sharply. You weren't easy to live with. The sentence drifted through the room like cigarette smoke. Slow, poisonous, familiar. Every justification had already been prepared long before discovery arrived. You disappeared years ago, Harold. No, I replied quietly. I worked. You hid inside work. I paid for this life. You think money replaces presence? I stared at her, because once again, part of her was right. And partial truth is what makes betrayal so psychologically dangerous. It forces you to grieve both the lies and your own failures simultaneously. I had missed birthdays because of overtime, missed anniversaries because of emergencies at work, missed conversations because exhaustion consumed whatever remained of me after survival. But none of that explained Richard. None of it explained deception. Loneliness may explain temptation. It does not excuse cruelty. Eleanor sat slowly on the edge of the bed, suddenly older, not softer, just tired. We didn't mean for it to happen. We. That word again. It sounded natural to her now. Practiced. How long? I repeated. She rubbed her forehead. A while. How long? Her eyes finally met mine. 15 years. The room became strangely distant. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just distant. As though my mind quietly stepped backward from reality to survive hearing it. 15 years. Nearly half my marriage. Daniel graduating college. Claire's divorce. Michael's failed businesses. Family vacations. Christmas mornings. Hospital visits. My father's funeral. All threaded beside a hidden life I never saw clearly enough. There are pains that arrive too large for immediate emotion. This was one of them. I sat slowly in the recliner near the window. The same recliner Eleanor once bought me after my back injury 20 years earlier. The leather had cracked near the armrests from years of use. Funny how objects reveal strain honestly, while people conceal it beneath politeness. She loves him, a voice whispered suddenly. I realized too late the voice belonged to me. Eleanor looked startled. It's complicated. No, I said. It isn't. Because deep down, some truths become simpler with age. People stay where they feel emotionally alive. And somewhere along the way, Eleanor stopped feeling alive beside me. The devastating part was not hearing that. It was realizing Richard had probably known before I did. My best friend. The man who stood beside me during surgeries, who carried my mother's coffin, who drank coffee in this very bedroom after my knee replacement while Eleanor brought us sandwiches. Memory itself began turning poisonous inside my head. How many people know? Her eyes widened slightly. What? About you two. Nobody. I held her gaze. She looked away first, which answered enough. I stood slowly. Did the children know? No. Too fast, too defensive. I felt cold again. Parents spend years protecting children from uncomfortable truths. Children often repay that kindness by protecting themselves from uncomfortable parents. Did they suspect? Eleanor's silence became unbearable. Then, a tiny nod. Something inside my chest physically hurt. Not metaphorically. A real ache spreading beneath my ribs. Because suddenly, dozens of moments rearranged themselves. Daniel defending Richard constantly. Michael joking that Mom smiled more around him. Family dinners where conversations shifted strangely when I entered rooms. Claire's occasional worried glances. I had mistaken discomfort for ordinary family tension. Maybe everyone else had simply adapted to the truth before I did. The cruelest humiliations are often public long before the victim notices. I moved toward the bedroom door. Where are you going? Downstairs. We should talk. We've been avoiding that for 15 years. I walked into the hallway before she could answer. The house felt different now. Not because of the affair, because certainty had vanished. I descended the staircase slowly, one hand brushing the wooden railing I installed myself 22 years earlier after termites damaged the original frame. I built half this house with overtime pay and weekend labor, and somehow still became temporary inside it. In the kitchen, I poured water into a glass and stood staring at the dark backyard. The motion light flickered near the fence. Beyond it sat the detached garage. Inside that garage was an old metal filing cabinet Eleanor had forgotten existed. Because I stopped using it years ago, or at least that's what everyone believed. The realization arrived quietly. Not revenge, not rage, something calmer, more dangerous. For the first time since discovering the truth, I stopped thinking like a wounded husband and started thinking like a man whose entire life had been observed, studied, manipulated for 15 years. Upstairs, I heard Eleanor moving quickly across the bedroom floor, but she was already too late. Because downstairs, standing alone in the dark kitchen with rainwater tapping softly against the windows, I finally understood something devastating. They had never expected me to become unpredictable. The garage smelled like cold metal and old rain. I stood there sometime after midnight, wearing the same wrinkled work shirt from earlier that day, staring at the gray filing cabinet beneath the hanging bulb. Dust covered the top. A rusted fishing reel sat beside a stack of warped paint cans nobody had touched in years. Perfect. People overlook the things that stop looking valuable. That was my first real advantage. I unlocked the cabinet slowly. Inside sat 20 years of duplicates, property records, tax files, insurance policies, bank accounts Eleanor never handled personally, investment statements, copies of wills, most importantly, documents connected to the lake property. I pulled the folder free and sat down heavily on the old wooden stool beside the workbench. Rain tapped softly against the garage roof. The sound reminded me of nights when the children were small and terrified of storms. I used to sit awake outside their bedrooms, waiting for thunder to pass so Eleanor could sleep uninterrupted before work. Funny, nobody remembers the invisible labor of love once it becomes expected. I opened the property file carefully, and there it was. The thing nobody else knew. Not Eleanor, not Richard, not even the children. The lake property had never fully transferred into my personal estate after my father died. Most of it remained protected under an old family trust my grandfather established decades earlier during a lawsuit involving his brothers. Complicated legal language. Boring paperwork. The kind families ignore until money suddenly matters. My father used to say, "Never tell people where the foundation beams are. They'll only notice them when they want the house." Back then, I thought he sounded paranoid. Now I understood he sounded experienced. A second folder sat beneath the trust documents. Inside, life insurance policies. 4 of them. Combined value high enough to change every relationship inside this family overnight. Eleanor thought she understood our finances because she managed the household spending. But I handled the long-term structures. Retirement, trusts, emergency reserves, quiet protections. The invisible architecture of stability. I stared at the paperwork for a long time. Not because I was planning revenge. Not yet. Because I was grieving something worse. The realization that my usefulness had become more important than my humanity years ago. Aging fathers often disappear in stages. First physically, then emotionally. Finally, financially. Once families believe your future value is measurable, love starts competing with mathematics. The garage door creaked open suddenly behind me. I didn't flinch. Eleanor stepped inside, wearing a sweater over her nightclothes. "You scared me," she whispered. "No," I said calmly. "You noticed me." She looked around the garage uneasily. The hanging bulb cast shadows beneath her eyes. "You shouldn't be out here alone this late." Interesting. After 15 years of deception, concern suddenly returned once paperwork entered the picture. I closed the file slowly. "What do you want?" She crossed her arms against the cold. "We need to figure this out." I almost smiled at the phrase. Figure this out. As though the affair were a plumbing issue or overdue bill. "How long has Richard had access to my study?" Her expression tightened. "That's your concern right now?" "Yes." Eleanor looked away briefly. "A few years." A key and access are different things. "He helped around the house." "No," I said softly. "He studied the house." That silence answered more than words could. I stood and placed the folders back into the cabinet. Eleanor watched carefully now. Too carefully. Fear changes observation into surveillance. "You think we were planning something?" she asked. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "I think people become dangerous when they feel entitled." "That's unfair." "Is it?" Her jaw flexed. "We didn't take anything from you." I laughed quietly then. A tired sound. "You took 15 years." She looked wounded by that. Good. Not because I wanted to hurt her. Because pain was finally entering the correct rooms. "You stopped loving me long before Richard," she whispered. That sentence settled heavily inside the garage. Because again, partly true. Marriage sometimes dies slowly from neglect before betrayal buries it. I had spent years exhausted, detached, emotionally unavailable in ways I barely noticed myself.
But sacrifice creates a dangerous illusion in men. We believe suffering automatically translates into love received. It doesn't.
Sometimes people simply adapt to your suffering until it becomes furniture. Eleanor stepped closer. I was lonely. I know. You never listened anymore. I know. You made me feel invisible. That one stayed with me, because invisibility was exactly what I had been feeling too. Two people starving emotionally inside the same house while pretending routine counted as intimacy. The tragedy might have ended there, but loneliness creates sympathy. Deception destroys it. Why Richard? She closed her eyes briefly. He paid attention. There it was. Not passion, not destiny. Attention. Small conversations. Remembered details. Presence. The things exhaustion had slowly stolen from me. I leaned against the workbench. You could have left. Her eyes opened again. You think divorce is simple after 30 years? No, I said. But betrayal wasn't simple either. The garage grew quiet except for rain and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Then Eleanor asked the question she truly came for. What's in those files? Straight to the center. No denial anymore. No moral defense. Just concern. I saw it clearly now. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of uncertainty. People can emotionally abandon a man for years and still panic the moment they lose predictability. I closed the filing cabinet. Nothing you need. Her face hardened immediately. Don't do this. Do what? Punish everyone because you're hurt. Everyone. Interesting choice again. I looked at her carefully. Who exactly is everyone? She hesitated. Too long. And suddenly another realization surfaced. Michael's constant emergencies, Daniel's entitlement, the strange confidence surrounding financial conversations lately. My stomach tightened. How much does Richard know about our finances? Not much. How much? Eleanor rubbed her forehead. He invested some money for Daniel. Using information from you? Silence. Cold. Heavy silence. I stepped closer, slowly. You discussed my assets with him. It wasn't like that. How was it? We were trying to help Daniel. No, I said quietly. You were planning futures with my resources. That hit. I saw shame flicker across her face for the first time all night. Tiny, brief, but real. And that frightened her more than my anger ever could. Because guilt means the story you built to justify yourself is beginning to crack. Then she whispered something I don't think she meant to say aloud. We thought you'd never notice. The garage suddenly felt freezing. Not because of the rain. Because some truths permanently alter how you remember your entire life. We thought. Not I thought. We. Plural. Shared assumptions. Shared discussions. Shared certainty that I would remain exactly where they placed me forever. Useful. Predictable. Blind. I stared at Eleanor for a long moment, then nodded once. Slowly. Calmly. And in that moment, something inside me finally stopped trying to save the marriage. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Like a man shutting off machinery after realizing the building has already burned down. Eleanor saw the change immediately. That frightened her too. Because for the first time since all this began, I looked completely calm. And people who rely on your emotional reactions become terrified the moment you stop providing them. The next morning, Eleanor made breakfast. That alone told me she was afraid. For years, our mornings had become transactional. Coffee poured in silence. Brief conversations about bills, groceries, grandchildren. Two people managing logistics instead of intimacy. But now bacon crackled in the pan before sunrise. Toast warmed in the oven. Fresh orange juice sat beside my plate. Fear often disguises itself as effort. I entered the kitchen wearing my work jacket. Eleanor looked up quickly. "I made eggs." I nodded once and sat down. The kitchen smelled warm, familiar, almost comforting. That was the dangerous part. Pain becomes confusing when betrayal continues wearing the face of home. "You should eat," she said softly. I cut into the eggs without tasting them. The ticking wall clock filled the silence between us. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "We need to talk about what happens next." I kept eating. There's no rush to make decisions. No rush. 15 years hidden. One night discovered. Now suddenly caution mattered. I placed the fork down carefully. "How long have the children suspected?" Her shoulders stiffened instantly. "We already talked about this." "No, you avoided it." Eleanor looked toward the sink. "Daniel probably noticed first." Something heavy settled in my chest. "When?" "A few years ago." A few years. My son had watched another man orbit his mother while accepting money from me across dinner tables. I looked down at my hands. They appeared older lately. The veins more visible. Knuckles thicker from decades lifting freight equipment and repairing things around the house. Funny how the body records sacrifice honestly, while families reinterpret it later as obligation. "Michael?" I asked. Eleanor hesitated again. "I don't know what he believed." That meant yes. Maybe not confirmation, but suspicion. Enough to alter respect. Children who lose respect for a father rarely announce it. They simply begin speaking over him slightly more often, consulting him less, correcting him publicly, treating his exhaustion like irrelevance instead of evidence. I stood and carried my plate to the sink. "You're leaving already?" "I have work." "You barely touched breakfast." I wasn't hungry. Her voice sharpened slightly. "You can't keep acting like this." I turned toward her. "Like what?" "Cold." Cold. Interesting word from someone who carried another relationship through half our marriage. "You don't get to decide my emotional temperature anymore." That silenced her. I grabbed my keys from the counter. Then Eleanor spoke quietly behind me. "Richard wants to talk." I stopped. Not because I was surprised, because hearing his name inside my house suddenly sounded invasive. "About what?" "He thinks maybe the three of us should sit down." The three of us. As if this were a business misunderstanding between adults, instead of a slow emotional execution spanning 15 years. I almost said no immediately. But something held me still. Observation. For decades, I had reacted emotionally, while everyone else quietly positioned themselves around me. Maybe it was time to reverse that. "When?" Eleanor blinked slightly. "You'll do it?" "When?" "Tonight." I nodded once and left. The freight office felt unusually loud that day. Forklifts screeching, phones ringing, men arguing over shipping delays. Ordinary noise pressing against a mind trying to reorganize 31 years of marriage. Around noon, my supervisor Frank entered my office carrying 2 coffees. Frank was 68, retired twice already, but kept returning because his second wife hated having him home constantly. He sat heavily across from me. "You look terrible." "I feel older than usual." He studied me quietly. Men our age develop instincts around suffering, not because we discuss emotions openly, because we recognize exhaustion like a shared language. "You sick?" "No." "Family?" That made me look up. Frank shrugged. "People don't wear that expression over work." I stared at the steam rising from the coffee cup. Then, before I could stop myself, I asked, "You ever realize too late that everyone around you had already changed?" Frank leaned back slowly. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether they changed," he said, "or whether you finally stopped protecting the version of them you preferred." The sentence stayed inside me long after he left, because that was exactly it. For years I had protected everyone from consequences. Daniel's irresponsibility, Michael's dependence, Eleanor's emotional distance, even Richard's increasing familiarity around the house. I explained away discomfort because maintaining peace felt easier than confronting truth. Some fathers become emotional janitors for their families, cleaning up tensions quietly, absorbing disrespect privately, maintaining stability no matter the personal cost. And eventually everyone mistakes that sacrifice for natural law. By late afternoon, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the attorney who handled my father's estate years earlier, Margaret Ellis, sharp-minded, ruthlessly organized. The type of woman who noticed hidden motives before people finished sentences. Her receptionist almost sounded shocked I was calling after so long. Margaret herself came on the line minutes later. "Harold?" "Hello, Margaret." "You all right?" Interesting how quickly competent people hear strain. "I need to review some documents." "What kind of documents?" "Everything." Silence. Then, "Come tomorrow morning." The second call went to the bank, not to move money, not yet, only to verify account structures Eleanor never paid attention to. The third call took longest, because my finger hovered over Claire's number for nearly a minute before dialing. My daughter answered on the second ring. "Dad?" Hearing her voice almost weakened my resolve. Claire still spoke to me with softness, genuine softness, not obligation. "You busy?" "No. What's wrong?" I looked out the office window toward the loading docks below. Rain clouds gathering again. "I need to ask you something honestly." Her voice changed immediately. "Okay. How long have you known about your mother and Richard?" Silence. Complete silence. And in that silence, everything answered itself. My eyes closed slowly. "Claire." "I didn't know for sure," she whispered quickly. "Dad, I swear." But she knew enough. Enough to pity me. Enough to watch me unknowingly perform husband and father inside a reality everyone else had partially adjusted to. "When?" Her breathing shook faintly. "About 2 years ago." I sat down heavily. 2 years. 2 full years my daughter carried this alone. "I wanted to tell you." "Why didn't you?" She started crying quietly. "Mom said it would destroy you." No. What destroyed me was the room full of people deciding I deserved ignorance more than truth. I rubbed my forehead slowly. Who else knows? "I think Daniel figured it out before me." "Michael?" Another silence. Michael doesn't care about things unless they affect him personally. That sounded accurate enough to hurt. Claire sniffled softly. Dad, I'm sorry. I stared at the rain beginning against the warehouse windows. Children eventually discover their parents are flawed. But there's something especially painful about discovering your children already knew you were being betrayed. Because suddenly every family gathering becomes contaminated retroactively. Every smile, every holiday, every conversation. You begin wondering how often sympathy replaced respect when people looked at you. Don't tell your mother we talked, I said quietly. Okay. And Claire? Yes? If people protect lies long enough, eventually they start believing the truth is the problem. She cried harder after that. I ended the call gently, then sat alone in my office while forklifts moved freight below and rain darkened the windows. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether my family had betrayed me. Now I was beginning to wonder how deeply they had built their future around the assumption that I would never do anything about it. I arrived home 20 minutes early on purpose. People reveal more when they think they still have time. The house was quiet, except for low voices drifting from the dining room. I stepped inside carefully, leaving the front door unlocked behind me. Eleanor was speaking first. He's calmer today. Richard answered softly, too low for full sentences. Then Eleanor again. I think he's more hurt than angry. Hurt. As if the distinction mattered after 15 years. I stood silently in the hallway, listening to my wife and my best friend discuss my emotional condition like relatives standing outside a hospital room. The strange thing was, I no longer felt shocked, only awake. That frightened me more than rage would have. Because rage burns fast. Awareness stays. I walked deliberately across the hardwood floor then, making enough noise for them to hear me approach. Conversation stopped instantly. Of course. When I entered the dining room, Richard stood beside the table wearing the blue quarter-zip sweater Eleanor once bought me for Christmas before deciding it looked better on him during a barbecue years ago. I remembered laughing at the time. Amazing what humiliation disguises itself as when trust still exists. Harold, Richard said carefully. I removed my coat and draped it over the chair. Richard? Eleanor looked tense now. Her fingers remained wrapped tightly around a coffee mug, though the drink had gone cold. Nobody offered me coffee. Interesting how quickly hospitality disappears once guilt enters the room. Richard gestured toward the table. Can we sit? We already are. He nodded slowly. Older men often mistake composure for control. Richard still believed this conversation could be managed if he sounded reasonable enough. That was his greatest misunderstanding about me. I sat across from them quietly. The old family photograph still hung on the wall behind Richard's shoulder. Beach vacation. 24 years earlier. Everyone smiling at a future none of us understood yet. Richard followed my eyes briefly before speaking. I never wanted this to happen. There it was. The universal opening line of people who repeatedly chose exactly what happened. I folded my hands together. How many times did you say that to yourself before coming over anyway? His jaw tightened slightly. Eleanor intervened quickly. We're trying to handle this maturely. Maturely, I repeated softly. Richard leaned forward. I know you hate me right now. No, I said honestly. Not yet. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Because hatred creates certainty.
And certainty gives people roles they understand.
But calm observation? That leaves room for consequences nobody can predict. Richard cleared his throat. This wasn't planned. 15 years. The number echoed silently between us. You accidentally betrayed me for a decade and a half? His face hardened slightly for the first time. We didn't mean to hurt you. I looked at Eleanor, then back at him. That sentence only comforts the people saying it. Silence settled heavily across the table. Rain tapped softly against the dining room windows. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily behind us. Tiny, ordinary sounds surrounding the collapse of a lifetime. Finally, Richard sighed. You want honesty? I almost laughed at the irony. No, I said quietly. I wanted honesty 15 years ago. That landed harder than I expected. Richard looked away first. Interesting. For years, I imagined that if this moment ever came, I would lose control emotionally. Shout, accuse, demand explanations. Instead, all I felt was exhaustion. Because betrayal discovered late doesn't explode, it settles. Like dust finally visible after sunlight enters the room. Richard rubbed his hands together slowly. It started after your father died. The words struck deeper than I anticipated. My father's funeral. I remembered Eleanor crying against Richard's chest while I greeted relatives beside the cemetery. At the time, I thought she was overwhelmed by grief. Now memory rearranged itself into something uglier. He was comforting you, I said. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Richard answered instead. You were shutting down emotionally. Maybe I was. Grief had hollowed me after my father died. I spent nearly a year functioning mechanically. Work, bills, repairs, sleep, repeat. Pain makes some men louder. Others disappear inside responsibility. Still, none of that explained 15 years. You could have left, I said again. Eleanor's voice came quietly this time. We tried ending it. I looked at her. How noble. Her eyes filled slightly with anger. You think this was easy? I stared at both of them. No, I said softly. I think it became normal. That silence confirmed everything. Affairs surviving 15 years stop feeling immoral to the people inside them. They become routines, private jokes, secret anniversaries, shared frustrations, an alternate marriage hidden inside the visible one. I suddenly realized Richard probably knew Eleanor's emotional life better than I had for years. Her fears, her moods, her favorite stories. Meanwhile, I remained useful. Useful husbands are often the last people informed their marriage already ended emotionally. Richard leaned forward again. We never wanted to destroy the family. The family was already destroyed, I replied. You just wanted me functional long enough not to notice. That hit harder than anything else I'd said, because both of them went still afterward. Perfectly still. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. They had discussed this possibility before. Not discovery specifically, but outcomes, contingencies, how much I might suspect, how I might react, what could happen financially. People involved in long deception eventually start preparing for exposure unconsciously. I looked at Richard carefully. How much do you know about my finances? Eleanor inhaled sharply. Richard answered too quickly. Not much. Interesting, I said. Because you seemed very comfortable discussing my father's property at dinner. That was hypothetical. No, I replied quietly. That was entitlement. His face changed then. Subtle, brief, but enough. There it was beneath the guilt. Expectation. Not just emotional access to my wife. Access to the future surrounding my life. I thought about Daniel asking for money, Michael's emergencies, the copied key, the missing paperwork. Suddenly, the edges of something larger became visible. Not a conspiracy, something more human. Dependency. Everyone had slowly built lives assuming my labor, stability, and silence would continue indefinitely. And Richard had positioned himself inside that structure so gradually nobody questioned it anymore. "How long have you had the house key?" I asked. "A long time." "How often were you here when I wasn't home?" Eleanor looked nervous now. Richard remained calm. "Harold, how often?" His silence answered enough. I leaned back slowly in the chair. There's a painful realization many aging fathers eventually face. The people closest to you often stop seeing your presence. They only notice your functions, paying bills, fixing problems, providing stability. And once someone else provides emotional fulfillment, you become infrastructure. Necessary, useful, forgettable. Eleanor suddenly spoke softly. "We did care about you." Did. Past tense. Interesting. I looked at her for several seconds, then nodded once. "I believe you." Both of them seemed surprised by that, because it was true. I believed they cared. In the same way people care about houses they plan to keep living inside. The realization brought neither rage nor tears anymore, only clarity. And clarity is dangerous once a patient man finally acquires it. Richard exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" I stood from the table. Neither of them moved. The dining room suddenly felt smaller than ever before. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. Then I looked directly at Richard. "But whatever happens next," I glanced briefly toward the hallway leading upstairs, "you should probably stop leaving personal things in my house." His face emptied instantly. Eleanor turned sharply toward him. Confusion, fear, calculation. And for the first time that evening, Richard looked genuinely nervous. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Richard's eyes remained fixed on me, while Eleanor looked back and forth between us, trying to understand whether I knew something specific or was simply provoking him. That was the advantage of silence. People fill it with their own fears. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor asked carefully. I kept my eyes on Richard. "The watch." A flicker crossed his face immediately. Tiny, fast, but unmistakable. Eleanor turned toward him. "What watch?" Richard answered too quickly. "It's nothing." "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." I walked past them toward the hallway closet near the staircase. The same closet where Eleanor used to store winter coats when the children were small. The same closet Richard had opened casually hundreds of times over the years, without anyone questioning why he moved through my house so comfortably. I reached into the back corner shelf and pulled out a small black leather case. Then I placed it gently on the dining table. Neither of them moved. Richard already knew what was inside. "You left it here 3 months ago," I said. Eleanor looked confused now. I opened the case slowly. Inside rested a silver watch. Expensive, elegant, personal. Engraved on the back, Forever was never the problem. Timing was. Eleanor's face drained of color. She looked at Richard slowly. "You said you lost this." Richard swallowed once. "I thought I did." "No," I said softly. "You forgot where you took it off." The room became unbearably still. I remembered the exact night I found it, 3 months earlier, a Thursday. I came home unexpectedly after a warehouse injury shut operations down early. The house had been empty, or so I thought. Then I noticed movement upstairs. By the time I reached the bedroom, the bathroom door shut quickly. Eleanor emerged moments later alone, claiming she had been cleaning. I believed her, because trust makes fools out of exhausted men. Later that evening, I found the watch hidden behind towels in the hallway closet. Richard claimed the next day he must have dropped it during a barbecue weeks earlier. At the time, the explanation sounded thin, but I accepted it anyway. Not because I was stupid, because people only recognize the truths they feel emotionally prepared to survive. Eleanor stared at the engraving now like it physically hurt to read. "You kept this?" she whispered. "Yes." "Why?" I looked at her carefully. Because part of me already knew. That sentence changed something in the room. The balance shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Until now, they believed discovery had happened suddenly, unexpectedly. Now they realized suspicion had existed much longer. Richard rubbed his forehead slowly. "You should have confronted us. Would you have told the truth?" Neither answered. Exactly. The old clock in the hallway ticked loudly through the silence. Eleanor finally sat down heavily. "Oh my God." But she wasn't grieving the affair. She was grieving exposure. There's a difference. Richard stood and paced toward the kitchen doorway. "I never wanted you to find out like this." I almost smiled again. Find out. As though betrayal itself were unfortunate only because it became visible. "You had 15 years to tell me. We tried ending it. You already said that. Because it's true." I studied him quietly. "No," I said. "What's true is you enjoyed both lives too much to choose." That hit hard. Richard looked away immediately. Because some truths only hurt when they're accurate. Eleanor spoke softly without lifting her head. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." That sentence stayed with me, because deep down, I believed her. Affairs rarely begin with destruction in mind. They begin with emotional convenience, attention, relief, escape. Then years pass, children grow older, mortgages get paid, routines calcify. And eventually the betrayal becomes woven so deeply into ordinary life that nobody inside it remembers how monstrous it would sound spoken aloud. I closed the watch case carefully. "Did the children ever meet him with you?" Eleanor's eyes snapped upward. "What?" "You heard me." "No. Too fast." I looked at Richard. He stayed silent, which answered enough. My stomach tightened. "How many times?" "It wasn't like that," Eleanor whispered. "How many times?" Her eyes filled with tears now. "Only a few dinners." A few dinners. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Family dinners. Shared vacations. Birthdays. My children laughing across tables while another version of their mother's life existed quietly beside mine. Maybe they justified it by telling themselves I already knew.
People rewrite reality when guilt becomes inconvenient. I suddenly remembered something from 2 summers earlier. A lakeside restaurant during Claire's birthday weekend.
Richard and Eleanor arriving together, because I had stayed behind fixing a flat tire. Daniel joking, "People already think you two are married." Everyone laughed, even me, especially me, because humiliation often survives longest when the victim participates willingly. I rubbed my face slowly. Age changes pain strangely. Young men explode when betrayed. Older men inventory it. Every memory becomes evidence. Every kindness becomes suspicious. Every delayed glance acquires new meaning. Eleanor stood suddenly. "I can't do this anymore." "No," I said quietly. "You already did it." She looked wounded again. Good. Not because suffering fixes betrayal, because truth had finally stopped protecting everyone except me. Richard returned to the table slowly. "We need to think carefully before this tears the family apart." I stared at him, then laughed softly for the first time all evening. Not bitterly, honestly, because the sentence was absurd. "The family has been torn apart for years," I said. "I was just the last person informed." Silence followed. Then Richard made a mistake, a small one, but revealing. "We can still handle this privately." We, again. Still speaking like a unit. Still unconsciously aligned against me. That was when I truly understood the depth of it. 15 years does not create an affair. It creates a partnership. And somehow, without realizing it, my wife and best friend had become more emotionally loyal to each other than either had been to me for a very long time. The realization hurt less now, mostly because numbness had started replacing shock. I stood slowly from the table. "I'm tired." Eleanor looked frightened suddenly. "Where are you going?" "Bed." "We should keep talking." "No," I replied calmly. "You should start worrying." Richard frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I looked at him for a long moment, then toward the staircase leading upstairs. "You both spent 15 years assuming I wouldn't notice what was happening inside my own house." Neither moved. "But if you misjudged me that badly once," I picked up the leather watch case, "you should probably consider what else you might not know." And for the first time since this began, I saw genuine panic move across Richard's face. I slept in the guest room that night. Or at least I lay there until morning, pretending rest was still possible. The guest room sat at the far end of the hallway beside Claire's old bedroom. Pale blue walls, a narrow bookshelf, an empty chair near the window where Eleanor used to sit folding laundry while the children played outside decades earlier. Memory lingers in rooms long after trust leaves them. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps pause outside the door. Not knocking, just standing there. Eleanor. I recognized the rhythm instantly. 31 years beside someone teaches you the sound of their hesitation. She remained there for nearly a minute before walking away again. Funny how people suddenly crave conversation once consequences become visible. By dawn, rain clouds had cleared completely. Thin sunlight stretched across the carpet while I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my father's old wristwatch ticking quietly in my hand. My father believed men should prepare emotionally for disappointment long before it arrives. Not cynically, practically. "Love people honestly," he used to say, "but never confuse love with immunity from human nature." I thought he sounded bitter back then. Now I wondered who hurt him badly enough to become wise. Downstairs, I could hear Eleanor moving around the kitchen carefully. Cabinet doors closing softly, coffee brewing, performing normalcy. That's what families do when collapse first enters the house. Everyone becomes strangely polite. I showered, dressed, and went downstairs around 7. Eleanor stood by the counter holding 2 mugs. "You still take it black," she said quietly. Still. As if routine might temporarily resurrect intimacy. I accepted the coffee without thanking her. Not to punish her, because gratitude suddenly felt inappropriate. We sat across from each other in silence while morning light filled the kitchen. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Richard didn't sleep last night either." Interesting. The update sounded almost involuntary, like she still viewed his emotional state as relevant to mine. I stared into the coffee. That must have been difficult for him. She flinched slightly. Good. People who betray quietly often depend on the betrayed person remaining emotionally generous forever. The moment generosity disappears, they begin feeling exposed. Eleanor rubbed her hands together. "What are you going to tell the children?" "Tell them what?" "You know what." I looked at her carefully. The truth? Fear crossed her face immediately. Not shame. Fear. There's an important difference between regretting betrayal and regretting exposure. "We need to think about the grandchildren," she whispered. Another shield. Children. Grandchildren. Family peace. The moral language people use once honesty threatens comfort. "You thought about them during the affair?" "That's not fair." "No," I agreed softly. "It isn't." Silence settled again. Then she asked the question she'd been avoiding since the garage. "What exactly is in those files?" There it was, finally, direct. I set the mug down carefully. "You're very interested in those files." "Because you're acting secretive." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm acting private. There's a difference." Her jaw tightened. "We're married." The sentence almost sounded ironic now. "We were married when you started sleeping with my best friend, too." She looked away immediately. Another silence. Then, "Do you still love me?" The question surprised me. Not because of the words, because she sounded sincere. That's the complicated thing about long betrayal. People can genuinely love you in broken ways while still destroying you quietly. I considered the question honestly. "I don't know," I answered. That hurt her more than anger would have, because uncertainty cannot be negotiated with. Eleanor's eyes filled slowly. "I never wanted to become this person." I believed her. Most people don't notice themselves changing gradually into someone capable of betrayal. Human beings adapt morally in small increments. First emotional dependence, then secrecy, then justification, then routine. By the time guilt arrives, the new life already feels too integrated to abandon. I stood and grabbed my keys. "I have a meeting." "With who?" "An attorney." Her face went pale instantly. "What?" I looked at her quietly. "Did you think I'd spend 15 years being deceived and continue behaving predictably?" "Harold, I'll be home later." Fear followed me out the door. Not the fear of losing me emotionally, the fear of losing structure. The fear people feel when stability begins developing boundaries. Margaret Ellis's office overlooked the river downtown. Same building, same polished oak furniture, same faint smell of paper and old coffee. Margaret herself looked almost unchanged, except for silver hair now framing sharper eyes. She studied me carefully as I entered. "You look terrible." "I've had a difficult week." That usually means divorce or death at our age. I sat heavily across from her desk. Potentially both. Margaret didn't smile. Good attorneys understand humor often masks disaster. She folded her hands. "Tell me everything." So I did. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts. The affair, the missing documents, the financial questions, the copied key. Margaret listened without interrupting once. By the time I finished, the office felt strangely smaller. Finally, she leaned back slowly. "How long have you suspected?" Apparently longer than I admitted to myself. "That's common." I looked toward the river outside the window. "How bad is this?" Margaret was quiet for several seconds. Then, "That depends how naive you've been financially." The honesty almost relieved me. No sympathy, no emotional cushioning, just clarity. I handed her copies of the trust paperwork. She adjusted her glasses and began reading carefully. Minutes passed. Then her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Well," she murmured. "What?" She looked up at me. "Your father was smarter than I realized." Something cold moved through me. "What do you mean?" Margaret tapped the documents. "The lake property isn't vulnerable in the way your wife probably assumes." I stayed silent. Neither are several investment accounts connected to the trust structure. Relief should have followed. Instead, I only felt sadness. Because suddenly, the entire marriage resembled a house built over hidden fault lines nobody else noticed. Margaret continued reading, then stopped abruptly at another page. "Did Eleanor know about this clause?" "What clause?" She turned the document toward me and pointed. I read it twice before fully understanding, then a third time. My stomach tightened slowly. Because buried inside my grandfather's trust agreement was a provision I had completely forgotten existed. A morality clause. Ancient, old-fashioned, almost absurd by modern standards, but legally valid. And if certain conditions involving infidelity and misuse of family assets could be demonstrated, Eleanor's access to major portions of the estate became drastically limited. Margaret studied my face carefully. "I'm assuming your wife doesn't know this exists." "No." "Does Richard?" I thought about the copied documents, the hidden searches, the financial conversations, then slowly shook my head. "No," I said quietly. Margaret closed the folder carefully. "Then Mr. Hale may have made the most expensive mistake of his life." The office suddenly felt completely silent. Outside, river water moved calmly beneath gray morning light. Inside, for the first time since discovering the affair, I realized something crucial. They thought they understood the structure holding this family together, but they had only ever seen the surface of it. Margaret spent the next 2 hours dismantling my life with professional precision. Not emotionally, legally. There's something strangely sobering about watching 31 years of marriage reduced into folders, signatures, asset structures, and vulnerability assessments. Love disappears quickly in conference rooms. What remains is exposure. Margaret removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "First," she said calmly, "you need to stop assuming this situation is purely emotional." I sat across from her silently. The river outside moved beneath pale morning light. Boats drifted slowly near the docks, while my marriage quietly transformed into a legal problem. What does that mean? It means long-term affairs involving shared financial discussions become dangerous very quickly. I thought about Daniel's investments, the missing paperwork, Richard discussing the lake property comfortably at dinner. Margaret studied me carefully. Harold, how much access has your wife had to your records over the years? Some. That's not an answer. I leaned back heavily. She handled household accounts, credit cards, smaller investments. But not the trust. No. Retirement restructuring? No. The holding accounts? No. Margaret nodded slowly. Good. Good. Interesting word, considering my entire family life was collapsing. She slid another document toward me. You protected yourself more than you realized. I wasn't trying to protect myself. No, she replied quietly. You were trying to protect the family. That sentence stayed with me, because it was true. Everything I built financially had been structured for stability. Education funds, emergency reserves, property protection. Not greed, security. Fathers spend decades trying to build futures sturdy enough that nobody notices the labor underneath them. And ironically, that invisibility often becomes the beginning of their erasure. Margaret tapped the trust paperwork again. This clause changes everything. I stared at the page. Legal language, cold, precise, yet devastating. If marital infidelity results in demonstrable financial manipulation or attempted interference regarding protected family assets. The sentence blurred briefly in front of me. Could Eleanor challenge it? She could try, Margaret said. But she'd need information she probably doesn't have. And Richard? Margaret's expression sharpened slightly. If Richard advised or participated in financial decisions involving your estate while engaged in a concealed relationship with your wife. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. I suddenly understood the scale of danger neither of them recognized yet. Not revenge. Exposure. People think consequences arrive through dramatic acts. Most arrive through documentation. Margaret folded her hands. You need to decide what you actually want. The question sat heavily between us. What are my options? Legally? Yes. Quiet separation, divorce, asset protection restructuring, fraud investigation if necessary. Fraud. The word sounded too severe. Until I remembered the missing files, the copied key, the investment conversations. Margaret watched my expression carefully. You still don't want to believe they crossed certain lines. I looked toward the window. No, but you suspect they might have. That was the terrible part. I no longer knew where emotional betrayal ended and practical betrayal began. When trust collapses, uncertainty poisons everything around it. Margaret opened another folder. I pulled something before you arrived. What? Property access logs. I frowned. For the lake property? She nodded, then slid several printed pages toward me. I read the dates slowly. My stomach tightened immediately. Richard's name appeared repeatedly across the last 4 years. Access requests, contractor consultations, land evaluations. Without my knowledge. I looked up sharply. What is this? Margaret's face remained calm. Your wife may not understand the trust structure. Richard apparently tried learning it. Cold spread slowly through my chest. He can't do that without authorization. He attempted preliminary consultations using information available through county records and third-party contacts. When? Repeatedly. The room suddenly felt airless. I stared at the pages. Dates connected themselves inside my head. Family dinners, strange financial conversations. Daniel suddenly discussing real estate investments. Richard asking casual questions about development zoning during barbecues. Not random curiosity. Interest. Strategic interest. Margaret spoke carefully now. Harold, I need you to answer honestly. I looked up. Do you believe Richard genuinely loved your wife? The question surprised me. Yes. And do you believe he also viewed your financial structure as opportunity? I wanted to say no immediately. Wanted desperately to preserve at least one human motive inside all this. But memory kept interrupting. Richard encouraging Daniel toward expensive investments. Richard joking about retirement properties. Richard gradually becoming involved in conversations that once belonged exclusively inside my marriage. A horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Perhaps emotional betrayal opened the door, but financial entitlement walked through afterward. I don't know anymore, I admitted. Margaret nodded sadly. That's usually how this stage feels. Stage, as though betrayal followed predictable phases. Maybe it did. She stood and walked toward the bookshelf behind her desk. When my husband cheated, she said quietly, the affair hurt less than realizing he had already reorganized his future emotionally before informing me. I looked at her, surprised. Margaret rarely discussed personal matters. She returned holding another binder. By the time people get caught after years of deception, they've usually built internal narratives where they no longer see themselves as betrayers. That sounds accurate. It's self-preservation. She sat again. Your wife probably believes the marriage died naturally years ago. I stared at the paperwork. And Richard? Margaret sighed faintly. Men like Richard often convince themselves proximity equals entitlement. That sentence hit hard, because Richard had slowly integrated himself into every vulnerable area of my life. My family, my home, my finances, my grief. Until eventually his presence stopped looking unusual. Like ivy growing over a house gradually enough, nobody notices structural damage until walls begin cracking. Margaret slid a yellow legal pad toward me. Start documenting everything you remember. For court? For clarity. I frowned slightly. What's the difference? She looked directly at me. Right now, you're still grieving emotionally. Eventually, you'll need to think strategically. I almost laughed. Strategic. For 31 years, my strategy had simply been endurance. Work harder, provide more, absorb tension quietly. I suddenly realized something painful. The entire family dynamic depended on me remaining emotionally simple, predictable, patient, forgiving. The moment complexity entered me, fear followed. Margaret interrupted my thoughts. There's something else. My stomach tightened again. What? She hesitated briefly. 3 months ago, someone attempted preliminary inquiries regarding transferring partial development rights connected to the lake property. I stared at her. Who? We don't know officially. But we both understood. I looked back down at the access records. 3 months ago. The same time I found Richard's watch hidden in the closet. The same period Daniel suddenly became obsessed with investment opportunities. The same month Eleanor started asking detailed questions about retirement restructuring. A pattern. Not certainty yet, but pattern. and patterns become difficult to ignore once emotional blindness disappears. Margaret spoke gently now. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your marriage wasn't the only thing being quietly reorganized behind your back. I sat completely still. Outside, rain began again against the office windows. Soft, steady, relentless. The kind of rain that lasts all day once it starts. And somewhere beneath that sound, another realization slowly settled into place. This might not have been just an affair hidden inside my life. It might have been a future they had already begun building, without me. I drove to the lake property alone after leaving Margaret's office. I hadn't visited in almost 8 months. That realization bothered me immediately. The land had belonged to my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built the small cabin near the water himself after returning from the war. My father taught me to fish there before arthritis twisted his hands too badly to bait hooks anymore. And somehow, life became busy enough that I stopped going. That's how people lose important things sometimes. Not through theft, through gradual absence. The gravel road leading toward the property looked narrower than I remembered. Rainwater collected in shallow potholes, while pine trees leaned heavily over the path like tired old men listening for trouble. The cabin finally appeared through the trees. Small, weathered, still standing. I parked beside the rusted metal fire pit and sat motionless for a moment. The silence out there felt different from silence at home. Cleaner somehow. No tension hidden beneath it. Only wind moving through branches and water tapping softly against the shoreline. I stepped out slowly. Cold air carried the scent of wet earth and pine needles. For the first time in days, my chest loosened slightly. Then I noticed the tire tracks. Fresh, not mine. I crouched near the mud beside the cabin. Truck tires. Recent. Very recent. Rain had softened the edges but not erased them. My stomach tightened. I walked toward the cabin door carefully. Unlocked. That stopped me cold. I never left it unlocked. Never. My father had been obsessive about locks after thieves vandalized part of the property decades earlier. I still carried his habits automatically. Yet now the door stood slightly open, just enough for darkness to show through the crack. I pushed it inward slowly. The smell hit first. Dust, old wood, coffee. Fresh coffee. Someone had been here recently enough for the scent to remain. The cabin interior looked mostly untouched at first glance. Small kitchen, stone fireplace, worn plaid couch facing the lake windows. But years of fixing and maintaining things teaches you observation. A chair sat slightly out of place near the table. Cabinet doors weren't closed fully. And on the kitchen counter, 2 coffee mugs. Not old, not dusty. Recent. I stood perfectly still inside my father's cabin while rain tapped softly against the roof. The realization moved through me slowly. Richard had been here. Maybe Eleanor, too. Inside the one place my father trusted only family with. I suddenly felt something sharper than heartbreak. Violation. People think betrayal hurts most inside bedrooms. Sometimes it hurts more inside sacred places. I walked toward the back room where my father used to keep tools and fishing equipment. The old wooden shelves remained mostly intact, but several boxes had clearly been moved recently. One sat open. Inside were old property maps and survey records. I stared at them quietly, then noticed something else. A legal pad resting beside the box. Not mine. Yellow paper covered with notes written in dark blue ink. Parcel estimates. Road access possibilities. Utility expansion costs. Development calculations. My chest went completely cold. I recognized Richard's handwriting instantly. 26 years of friendship teaches you little details like that. I picked up the legal pad slowly. Several pages had been torn out, but enough remained. At the bottom of one page, circled twice, potential resort partnership interest. Below that, a number. Estimated land value after development. The figure made my stomach tighten. Not because of greed, because suddenly everything rearranged itself again. The conversations, the financial curiosity, Daniel's investment obsession, the property discussions at dinner. This wasn't random fantasy. They had been exploring possibilities. Inside my father's cabin. Without me. I sat slowly in the old wooden chair near the window. Rain blurred the lake outside into gray moving shadows. My father's fishing rods still leaned untouched in the corner.
An old family photograph rested crooked beside the fireplace mantel.
Me and Eleanor there too. Young, laughing, still believing loyalty meant permanence. I looked around the cabin and realized something devastating. Richard had likely stood in this exact room discussing futures that no longer included me. Not openly, perhaps, not maliciously at first, but gradually, comfortably, like people rearranging furniture inside a house they already expected to inherit emotionally. There's a painful moment many fathers eventually experience. You realize people stopped seeing your sacrifices as gifts long ago. They started seeing them as infrastructure. And infrastructure eventually gets repurposed. A floorboard creaked outside suddenly. I stood immediately. Then heard footsteps approaching the porch. Slow, careful. The front door opened. Richard froze the instant he saw me. Rainwater darkened his jacket shoulders. His truck keys remained in one hand. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes moved toward the legal pad on the table. Everything changed in his expression. Not guilt first. Calculation. "How long have you been here?" he asked quietly. Interesting. No surprise about why I was there. No discomfort entering my family property uninvited, only concern about what I had seen. Long enough? Rain hammered harder against the roof now. Richard closed the door behind him slowly. This isn't what it looks like. That sentence almost exhausted me more than the affair itself. Because people always say that when the truth looks exactly like itself. I held up the legal pad. You were planning development projects on my family land. He exhaled heavily. Nothing was finalized. Finalized. Not denied, not hypothetical. Finalized. I nodded slowly. When were you planning to mention this? Richard stepped farther into the cabin. Harold, listen to me. No, I said quietly. You've been speaking for 15 years. I think I'll listen to the silence instead. That unsettled him immediately. Good. For decades, Richard understood me as predictable, calm, reasonable, emotionally accommodating. But betrayal changes observation into intelligence. And now I was finally paying attention properly. Richard rubbed his forehead. Daniel brought me the idea. That stopped me cold. What? He thought the property could solve a lot of financial problems. My son. The words echoed painfully inside my chest. Richard continued carefully. We only explored possibilities. We. Again. Always we. I stared at him across my father's cabin while rain pounded the roof harder and harder. How long has Daniel known? Richard hesitated. Too long. How long? A while.
The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter, more airless. Not because of anger, because humiliation kept expanding retroactively through memory. Family barbecues, investment conversations,
Jokes, subtle exclusions. All of them suddenly contaminated by shared knowledge I never possessed. Richard stepped closer. Your children were worried about you. I laughed quietly then, a broken sound. Worried enough to plan around me? That's not fair.
"No," I said softly. "What's unfair is realizing my own family discussed my future like a scheduling issue." Richard looked genuinely tired suddenly. Older. "You think I wanted this?" I stared at him carefully, then around the cabin. The notes, the surveys, the calculations. "Yes," I answered honestly. "I think eventually you did." And judging by the silence that followed, he knew it too. Richard sat down heavily across from me at the cabin table. For the first time since all this began, he looked old. Not physically, morally. Like years of rationalization were suddenly exhausting to carry. Rain continued hammering the roof while cold lake wind pushed softly against the windows.
Neither of us spoke immediately. The legal pad remained between us like evidence in a courtroom nobody wanted to acknowledge existed. Finally, Richard rubbed both hands over his face. It started small. I almost smiled. Everything destructive starts small. Affairs, resentment, entitlement. People imagine collapse arrives dramatically. Usually it grows quietly inside ordinary conversations. You don't get to explain this into innocence, I said calmly. I'm not trying to. That surprised me slightly. Richard looked toward the lake. Your father hated me. The sentence came unexpectedly. I frowned. What? He never trusted me. I stared at him. My father invited you fishing. Because you asked him to. Rainwater slid slowly down the windows behind him. Richard's expression drifted somewhere distant. The old man watched everybody carefully. That part was true. My father rarely spoke unnecessarily, but nothing escaped him. He had grown up poor during difficult years, when trusting the wrong people could cost entire families stability. He told me something once, Richard continued quietly. I stayed silent. He said men who enter another family too comfortably eventually forget where the boundaries are. Cold spread slowly through my chest. When did he say that? About a year before he died. I looked away toward the fireplace. The old man knew, or at least suspected enough to become wary, and somehow I missed it entirely. That realization hurt in ways I couldn't fully explain. Children spend half their lives believing parents exaggerate danger. Then adulthood becomes the gradual discovery that experience was often just pain translated into caution. Richard leaned forward slightly. You want the truth? No, I replied. I want the version nobody softened for my comfort. That silence told me he understood exactly what I meant. For years, everyone around me had edited reality carefully. Protecting me, managing me, positioning information around me like furniture. The humiliation wasn't just betrayal, it was paternalism. Richard looked down at the legal pad. The property idea started with Daniel. I kept listening. He was drowning financially. I know. He thought development money could stabilize things. And you volunteered to help. Richard nodded slowly. At first, it was only discussion. At first.
I repeated. Because beginnings matter less than continuation. That's what people never understand about betrayal. One mistake can be human. Sustaining deception for years requires character. Richard's voice lowered. Harold, your family was scared. Of what? You disappearing. I almost laughed again. Not because it was funny, because the irony bordered on cruelty. They already replaced me emotionally. That's not true. No? I looked directly at him.
Then why did everybody protect the affair instead of the marriage? Richard had no answer for that. Only silence. The honest kind this time. I stood and walked toward the fireplace mantel, where the old family photograph still rested crookedly. My fingers brushed dust from the frame. You know what the worst part is? I asked quietly. Richard remained seated behind me. I can survive betrayal. I looked at the photograph. But I don't know how to survive realizing everyone adapted to my humiliation before I did. The cabin felt unbearably quiet afterward. Even the rain seemed distant suddenly. Richard finally stood. Claire wanted to tell you. That made me close my eyes briefly. She cried about it, he added softly. Of course she did. Claire still possessed empathy the others slowly traded away for convenience. What about Michael? Richard sighed faintly. Michael avoids uncomfortable things. That sounded accurate enough to hurt. And Daniel? Another pause, longer this time. Then, Daniel thought you already knew. I turned around slowly. What? Richard looked exhausted now. He assumed no man misses something like this for 15 years. The words struck harder than anything else that day. Not because they were cruel, because they revealed exactly how diminished I had become inside my own family's perception. Not father, not husband. An aging structure people assumed no longer truly observed anything. I sat back down heavily. Rainwater dripped steadily from the porch outside. Somewhere across the lake, thunder rolled faintly through the trees. When did Daniel find out? Maybe 4 years ago? 4 years. My son discussing investments with the man sleeping with his mother while accepting financial help from me at holidays. I rubbed my forehead slowly. Children judge fathers strangely as they age. The moment a father appears emotionally tired, some children stop seeing wisdom and start seeing obsolescence. Richard sat carefully again. He didn't hate you. That's comforting. I mean it. I looked at him. No, I said quietly. You mean he still found me useful? That landed hard enough. Richard looked away. Because usefulness had become the center of everything. My labor, my money, my stability, my silence. The family needed all of it intact. They just stopped needing me emotionally attached to it. I suddenly remembered a conversation from years earlier. Daniel helping me repair the back fence after a storm. He had looked at my hands and laughed softly. You work like you think everything falls apart if you stop. At the time, I thought it was admiration. Now I realized it was observation. Maybe the entire family understood my role long before I did. Richard interrupted my thoughts carefully. We weren't trying to steal from you. I looked around the cabin slowly. The maps, the notes, the projections. No, I replied. You were trying to build a future around me without involving me. His silence confirmed enough. That was the true horror of long betrayal.
Not immediate cruelty, gradual replacement. People reorganizing emotional and financial realities slowly enough that eventually your absence begins feeling manageable to them. The cabin door rattled suddenly from a gust of wind. Richard glanced toward it before speaking again. "You should know something else." My chest tightened. "What?" He hesitated, then finally said, "Eleanor tried ending things after your heart scare." I froze. 3 years earlier. Chest pain at work, hospital overnight, tests, fear. I remembered Eleanor crying beside the hospital bed, holding my hand. Richard continued quietly. "She panicked." I stared at him.
And? She said if something happened to you, she couldn't live with herself. That should have comforted me. Instead, it devastated me further. Because even guilt had not stopped them. Nothing had. Not illness, not family, not time. Some betrayals survive because the people inside them stop believing consequences will ever arrive. I looked toward the lake again. Gray water moved beneath heavy clouds while rain softened the shoreline into blur. My father once told me something while teaching me to fish here as a child. Men rarely lose families all at once. Usually they lose authority first, then respect, then eventually they lose the right to know what's happening around them. At the time I thought he sounded old. Now I realized he sounded experienced. Richard stood slowly. "What are you going to do?" I considered the question carefully, then looked around the cabin one final time. "My father built this place after the war because he said every man needs one room in the world where truth can survive." Richard stayed silent. I picked up the legal pad. "And lately," I said quietly, "truth seems to be the one thing everybody around me's been trying hardest to manage." Then I walked past him toward the door. But before leaving, I stopped. Because near the coat rack beside the entrance sat something I hadn't noticed earlier. A small red scarf. Eleanor's. Which meant one devastating thing became undeniable. My wife hadn't just visited this cabin. She had been coming here often enough to leave pieces of herself behind. I picked up the scarf slowly. Soft wool, dark red, still carrying the faint scent of Eleanor's perfume. For a moment, the cabin disappeared around me. Not physically, emotionally, because memory rushed in too quickly. I bought that scarf 12 winters earlier during a trip to Chicago. Eleanor had worn it during Claire's graduation dinner. Later during Christmas photographs beside the fireplace. On cold mornings while drinking coffee near the kitchen window. Ordinary memories suddenly turned poisonous once attached to hidden realities. Richard watched me carefully from across the room. "She forgot it last month," he said quietly. Last month. Not years ago. Not accidentally forgotten during some ancient mistake. Recent. Ongoing. The affair wasn't surviving out of habit alone anymore. It had become part of their actual life. I folded the scarf once and placed it gently on the table beside the development notes. "You brought her here." Richard exhaled slowly. "Yes." No excuses this time. No softening language. Just truth. Strange how honesty finally arrives only after deception becomes impossible to maintain. Rain continued falling steadily outside while I stared at the scarf. My father's cabin. The one place in the world that still felt untouched by performance. Or at least it had.
Now even this place carried evidence of another hidden life unfolding around me. "There's more, isn't there?" I asked quietly. Richard didn't answer immediately, which answered enough already. I sat back down slowly. "How bad?" He rubbed his jaw heavily. "We looked into selling part of the shoreline." The room became completely silent. Even the rain seemed distant suddenly. "You what?" Richard held up both hands slightly. "Nothing happened. You explored selling family land without telling me? It was only preliminary. That land buried my grandfather." My voice remained calm. That frightened him more than shouting would have. Because men like Richard understood anger. Anger passes, but calm disappointment? That settles permanently. He sat again slowly. "Daniel pushed hard for it." There was my son again, circling every rotten detail lately. I stared at the development estimates on the legal pad. How involved was he? Richard hesitated. Too long. Then, he thought the property could solve everyone's problems. Everyone. Interesting word. Not my problems. Not the family's survival. Everyone's future. Built quietly around assets they already emotionally disconnected from me. A terrible realization settled into place. Maybe they didn't view themselves as stealing. Maybe they viewed themselves as reorganizing inevitability. Aging fathers become abstract to some families eventually. Not fully human anymore, just aging systems approaching transfer. Richard spoke carefully. "He thought you'd never actually use the land again." That sentence hurt more than I expected, because it was partially true. I hadn't visited in months, maybe longer than that. Life narrowed gradually over the years. Work, bills, grandchildren's birthdays, doctor appointments, exhaustion. Meanwhile, pieces of me quietly disappeared from my own life without resistance. The cabin, the marriage, the authority, the respect, all surrendered gradually through neglect and fatigue. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the lake. Rain blurred everything silver gray beyond the glass. "You know the strange part?" I said softly. Richard stayed quiet behind me. "I probably would have helped Daniel if he asked honestly." That was the tragedy underneath all of it. Not money, not property. The assumption that manipulation was safer than truth. Richard sighed heavily. "People got used to avoiding difficult conversations with you." I turned slowly. "What's that supposed to mean?" His expression tightened. "You always carried everything yourself." I stared at him. "And that justified this?" "No." "Then what exactly are you saying?" Richard rubbed his forehead again. "I'm saying your family stopped believing you needed honesty as much as stability." That sentence hit with horrifying precision. Because suddenly, decades rearranged themselves. I had become the reliable one, the calm one, the provider. The person who solved problems quietly while everyone else pursued emotion. And somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing me as emotionally vulnerable at all. Just durable. People rarely ask durable men how much pain they're carrying. They simply add more weight. I looked down at the scarf again. "How long has she been coming here?" Richard answered quietly. 3 years. 3 years. Inside my father's cabin. The one place tied most closely to my family history. I suddenly understood why Eleanor cried so hard during my hospital stay. Not just guilt. Fear. Because if I died unexpectedly,
All these hidden worlds would collide violently at once. Richard stepped closer carefully.
She still cares about you. I almost laughed again. Care had become such a meaningless word lately. People care about pets while forgetting to feed them properly. People care about houses while letting foundations rot. Care without loyalty is just sentiment. What exactly does she care about? I asked quietly. He had no answer, only silence. Again. That was the thing about truth. Eventually it reduces everyone to silence, because language can no longer soften reality enough. Then Richard said something that changed everything again. She wanted to tell you after retirement. I stared at him. What? She thought once work ended, maybe the marriage could end peacefully too. The words moved through me like ice water. Retirement. I had spent years planning it carefully. Savings, property protection, medical coverage. All while my wife quietly planned an exit strategy emotionally timed around financial stability. Not because she hated me, because she had already mentally reorganized life beyond me. How long ago did she decide that? Richard looked genuinely ashamed for the first time. A while. Of course. There it was again. That vague timeline protecting everyone except the man being discussed. I sat down heavily in my father's chair near the fireplace. The old wood creaked beneath me. My father died in that chair 8 years earlier after falling asleep during a thunderstorm. I remembered covering him with a blanket before realizing he wasn't breathing anymore. Back then, grief felt unbearable. Now I understood something worse than grief existed. Becoming emotionally obsolete inside your own life before you realize replacement already happened. Richard looked exhausted now too. You think we're monsters? I looked at him carefully. No. That surprised him. Then what? I think you got comfortable. That landed harder than accusations. Because comfort was exactly what destroyed everything. Comfort with secrecy. Comfort with entitlement. Comfort with my silence. Comfort assuming I would absorb humiliation indefinitely. The rain outside finally began easing into softer drops against the roof. Gray light filtered through the cabin windows, and suddenly I felt tired beyond anger. Not weak, just old. Old in the way men become after realizing entire chapters of their lives were edited without permission. I stood slowly and picked up Eleanor's scarf, then folded it carefully and handed it to Richard. Give this back to her. He took it cautiously. I looked around the cabin one final time. The fishing rods, the fireplace, the old photographs, the development notes beside coffee cups still faintly smelling fresh. Everything sacred eventually becomes vulnerable once enough people stop respecting boundaries. I moved toward the door. Harold. I paused without turning around. Richard's voice sounded smaller now. What happens next? I stared at the rain-soaked trees outside, then answered honestly. For 31 years, I said quietly, I thought I was protecting my family. The cabin remained silent behind me. But lately, I continued, I'm starting to realize I may have only been protecting everyone from consequences. Then I walked outside into the cold rain. And behind me, for the first time in 26 years, Richard did not follow. I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I drove aimlessly through back roads while rain blurred the windshield and old country radio stations drifted in and out through static.
At some point, I ended up parked outside a grocery store 20 miles from town, staring at strangers loading bags into their cars. Ordinary people, ordinary lives. A woman helping her husband zip up a child's coat. An old couple arguing gently over oranges. A teenage boy carrying flowers awkwardly beside his girlfriend. Small moments. Simple loyalties.
Funny how betrayal makes basic decency suddenly feel extraordinary. I sat there nearly 40 minutes before my phone vibrated. Claire. I considered ignoring it, then answered quietly. Hello? Dad? Her voice sounded tight. You okay? No. Honesty came easier lately. Claire exhaled shakily. Mom's panicking. I stared through rainwater sliding down the windshield. That sounds exhausting for her. Dad! There was pain in her voice now. Real pain, not manipulation. I didn't know about the property. I believe you. I mean it. I know. Silence settled between us. Then Claire asked softly, Where are you? Driving. You shouldn't be alone right now. The sentence almost broke something inside me. Because after days of lies and calculations and hidden structures, simple concern sounded foreign. I've been alone a long time, I said quietly. She started crying again. Not loudly. Just the exhausted crying of someone watching a family split open slowly from the inside. I hate all of this. So do I. Another silence. Then, Daniel and Michael are coming over tonight. Of course they were. Families gather quickly once financial fear enters the room. Why? They want to talk. No, I replied softly. They want information. Claire didn't answer, because she knew I was right. Children who ignore emotional fractures for years suddenly become highly attentive once stability appears threatened. Mom says you met with a lawyer. Interesting. Not, Mom says she hurt you. Mom says the marriage is collapsing. Only concern about legal movement. Yes. Dad. What? She's scared. I looked out at the parking lot. Rain had almost stopped now. Thin evening light stretched weakly across wet pavement. Your mother stopped protecting me years ago, I said quietly. I'm not responsible for protecting her from fear anymore. Claire inhaled sharply, then whispered, You sound different. That stayed with me. Different. Maybe I was. Pain changes men slowly at first, then suddenly. Like rivers eroding stone invisibly for years before entire sections collapse overnight. I'll come by tomorrow, Claire said. You don't need to choose sides. I already chose yours years ago. That hit harder than I expected. Not because it healed anything, because it confirmed she'd been carrying this burden alone much longer than I realized. After we ended the call, I sat in silence another few minutes before finally driving home. 3 cars already filled the driveway when I arrived. Daniel's black SUV, Michael's truck, Claire's small sedan. The family meeting had begun without me. Of course it had. I remained in the car briefly, watching light move behind living room curtains. People shifting anxiously inside the house I spent 31 years paying for. Strange feeling. Realizing your own home has become a room full of conversations you were never meant to hear. Honestly. When I finally entered, every voice stopped instantly. The living room looked exactly like every holiday gathering from the past decade. Same furniture, same lamp beside Eleanor's chair. Same family photographs lining the walls. Only now, everyone looked afraid instead of comfortable. Daniel stood first. "Dad?" Michael remained seated, but visibly tense. Claire looked relieved just seeing me walk in. Eleanor stood near the fireplace, clutching Richard's red scarf tightly in both hands. That detail told me enough already. Richard had spoken to her. Probably everything. I removed my jacket slowly. Nobody moved. The atmosphere reminded me strangely of hospital waiting rooms. Everyone polite. Everyone exhausted. Everyone waiting for bad news nobody wants spoken aloud. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "We need to talk." I almost smiled. Interesting how often people say that, after years avoiding exactly that. I sat in the recliner near the window. My recliner. The worn brown leather one Eleanor once begged me to replace because it looked too old. Now everyone seemed careful not to sit in it. "All right," I said quietly. "Talk." Nobody did. The clock ticked loudly from the hallway. Michael finally rubbed his hands together nervously. "Dad, this whole thing's gotten out of control." Out of control. Like a fire nobody started intentionally. I looked at him calmly. "No," I said. "It stayed controlled for 15 years. That's the problem." Silence again. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "We never wanted you hurt." There was that sentence again, repeated by everyone except the man who actually suffered the consequences. "You all seemed willing to risk it anyway." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think we're against you?" I stared at him for several seconds, then asked quietly, "When exactly were you planning to tell me about the lake property discussions?" The room froze, completely. Michael turned sharply toward Daniel. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Eleanor looked horrified. And Daniel looked caught. There it was. Not confusion. Recognition. My own son understood instantly what I had discovered. "That's not what you think," he said quickly. Interesting. Nobody denied it happened anymore. Only the interpretation. I leaned back slowly in the recliner. "Then explain it properly." Daniel hesitated, and in that hesitation, I watched 30 years of fatherhood rearrange themselves painfully inside my chest. Because suddenly, I no longer saw my son as a boy I raised. I saw a grown man who had spent years deciding how much truth I deserved access to. Finally, he spoke. "I was trying to help." With what? Everything. He gestured vaguely around the room. Money, stress, retirement. The property just sits there. Just sits there. My grandfather's land. My father's cabin. The place where generations of our family carried grief, holidays, memory. Reduced now to unused asset value. You discussed selling it with Richard. It wasn't finalized. That word again. Finalized. Meaning serious enough to progress beyond fantasy. I looked toward Eleanor. "You knew?" Her voice cracked immediately. Not at first. Not denial. Never denial anymore. Only timelines. Michael stood abruptly then. "This is insane." Everyone turned toward him. "I swear to God, I didn't know about selling the property." Daniel snapped back immediately. "Because you never pay attention to anything." "There it is," Michael shot back. "You always think you know what's best for everybody." The room suddenly shifted, not toward reconciliation, toward fracture. Real fracture. Because hidden resentments were finally losing the protection my silence used to provide. And sitting there, listening to my children begin turning on each other, I realized something devastating. The family wasn't collapsing because I discovered the truth. The truth was simply removing the last thing holding the collapse together. Me. Nobody spoke after that. The room simply unraveled. Michael pacing near the kitchen, Daniel staring at the floor with clenched fists, Claire crying quietly into both hands, Eleanor standing frozen beside the fireplace, still holding that red scarf like it belonged to a different lifetime. And me, sitting in the old recliner everyone once mocked for being too worn out to keep. Funny thing about old furniture. The pieces people rush to replace are usually the ones that held the most weight. Rain tapped softly against the windows again, a weak storm drifting back through town like unfinished business. Daniel finally looked at me. For the first time all night, he didn't look defensive. He looked young. Not physically.
Emotionally. Like a man suddenly realizing adulthood had arrived years ago, while wisdom never did. "Dad," he said quietly, "I thought I was helping everybody survive." I studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I know." The room went still again. Because forgiveness wasn't what anyone expected from me anymore. But this wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. Families rarely destroy themselves through hatred alone. More often through convenience, cowardice, avoidance. People choosing comfort repeatedly until loyalty quietly dies underneath it. Michael sat down heavily and covered his face. Claire moved beside him instinctively. Eleanor finally spoke through tears. "I never stopped loving you." That sentence floated weakly through the room. 31 years compressed into 8 words too late to save anything. I looked at her carefully. "I think you loved different versions of me," I said softly. "The young man, the provider, the stable one, the forgiving one." She cried harder. "But somewhere along the way," I continued, "you stopped loving the man himself enough to tell him the truth." Nobody moved. The old clock ticked steadily in the hallway, a sound so ordinary it almost hurt. I looked around the living room slowly. Every photograph, every lamp, every repaired cabinet and patched wall. I built this entire life with my hands. And somewhere along the way, everyone inside it started believing the structure could survive without the person holding it upright. That was their mistake. Not the affair. Not the lies. Not even the property discussions. The mistake was assuming silent men stop seeing things. I stood slowly from the recliner. The leather groaned softly beneath me. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and removed a small ring of keys. House keys. Storage keys. Lake property keys. I placed them carefully on the coffee table. Nobody spoke. "I spent most of my life thinking love meant endurance," I said quietly. "Absorbing pressure, fixing damage, keeping everyone together no matter the cost." My eyes drifted toward the family photographs lining the wall. But eventually a man has to ask himself a dangerous question. Daniel looked up slowly. "So what's the question?" I looked directly at him. What exactly survives after people stop respecting the person doing the sacrificing? Silence answered for everyone. I picked up my father's old wristwatch from my pocket and fastened it slowly around my wrist. Tick, tick, tick. Steady. Certain.
the same sound I listened to as a boy sitting beside him at the lake. My father once told me something near the end of his life. We were sitting on the cabin porch during another rainy evening like this one. He looked out across the water and said, "Some men die long before they're buried."
Usually when the people they built their lives around stop seeing them clearly. Back then, I thought he was talking about aging. Now I understood. He was talking about invisibility. I looked toward Eleanor one final time, then toward my sons, then Claire. "I'm not angry anymore," I said honestly. That frightened them more than rage ever could have. Because anger leaves room for reconciliation. Peace does not. I'm just finished carrying people who learned to mistake my silence for permission. Claire began crying again. Michael stared at the floor. Daniel looked like someone had taken the ground out from underneath him. And Eleanor finally understood what was happening. Not divorce, not scandal, not revenge. Departure. Emotional departure. The kind that happens quietly after years of being slowly erased. I grabbed my coat from the chair beside the door. "Dad," Claire whispered. I smiled at her softly. A real smile this time. Small, tired, but real. You were the only one who still looked at me like a person instead of a solution. She broke completely after that. I opened the front door slowly. Cold rain air drifted inside. Behind me, nobody tried stopping me. Maybe because they finally understood something terrible. You can manipulate guilt. You can negotiate anger. You can survive resentment. But once a quiet man truly lets go, there's nothing left to hold on to. I stepped outside into the rain and closed the door gently behind me. Not slammed, not violently, just closed. The porch light glowed weakly against wet pavement while thunder rolled faintly somewhere far beyond the neighborhood. And standing there alone at 68 years old, listening to rain strike the roof of the house I spent my life building, I realized something strange. For the first time in decades, the silence no longer belonged to them.